I want to talk to you today about resurrection, but in the real world. You know, I try hard, I'm sure you do too, to be a fair-minded person. I will listen to anybody's ideas before making up my mind, but sometimes that's harder to do than at other times. I'm also very much aware of the power of human emotions, especially around holiday seasons, even Easter. And strong emotions can tamper with our minds and convince even a rational person of the reality of an experience, even when it defies logic and mocks the odds of ever happening. So what did occur that early Easter morning 2 millenniums ago? And what does it mean for us and our lives and our faith today? Inquiring minds want to know about resurrection, but in this real world. And if tales of resurrected corpses walking around and talking makes you uncomfortable, know that you're not alone. In our progressive Christian tradition, many have questioned what the resurrection really means. A couple of years ago, Ken Burns directed a wonderful PBS special series about the Lewis and Clark expedition. It was entitled The Corpse of Discovery. And there was a dramatic moment in that film that can serve as a wonderful parable for us in our search for the meaning of the Christian claim that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. After months of hard going, Meriwether Lewis and a small party reached the Continental Divide in the Rocky Mountains. For more than 300 years, people in America and in Europe had believed that there was a northwestern passage, a water route by which one could cross across the entire North American continent and make their way to the Pacific Ocean. President Thomas Jefferson had commissioned Lewis and Clark to find that passage. And as Lewis and his party walked up the slopes of that hill that morning, the hopes and the expectations of 3 centuries accompanied them. Upon reaching the crest, Lewis eagerly expected at long last to see what so many had longed for. He could see the Northwest Passage. But when he reached the top and he looked west, all he could witness were more mountains as far as the eye could see, dashing one of the major hopes of the expedition. But that morning of disappointment was also a morning of discovery, for Lewis did find himself looking at a vast new territory of stunning beauty, opening a new era of history that would far exceed anything that he or President Thomas Jefferson could ever imagine. So I'm going to suggest in like fashion, the folks who walk up the long slopes toward the Continental Divide of Easter faith and history, hoping to find some factual confirmation for faith in the resurrection of Christ, transmitted by centuries of Christian tradition, may be disappointed more and more in this modern era by what they will find. But that disappointment can be a new discovery. For coming into view is a vast new territory of insight and meaning just waiting to be explored. And I believe that makes our spiritual journey in the modern era all the more worthwhile and challenging. The best place to begin for anyone who wants to understand or experience the Christian affirmation of the resurrection is the fact that the resurrection was a Jewish belief 2 centuries before it ever became a Christian belief. The very first hope of resurrection after death in the Bible is in the book of Daniel. This book was written almost 200 years before Jesus, at a time when the Jews were encountering persecution at the hands of a Syrian king, Antiochus Epiphanes. And you can read about that in the 2 books of the Maccabees that were written 50 years later. And those books are contained in the Roman Catholic Bible. They share the story of the persecution of the Jews in gruesome detail. But whether you're reading Daniel or the Maccabee books, you see that the Jews were banned from practicing their own faith and observances. They were threatened to be executed just for defying the king's command. And many Jews went to their graves rather than disobey what they believed to be God's law. And they were willing to do this because they believed that in the end, God would raise them up. God would not let injustice win. So the Jewish hope of resurrection was not a mere flash-in-the-pan belief. It was an affirmation of faith in a just and loving God. As one Jewish mother who had 7 sons who were martyred says in 2 Maccabees, if God has the power to create life, God also has the power to restore life. So this idea, this belief in resurrection appeared in the history of Israel at a time when committing yourself to live by this just and the compassionate ways of God seemed like a very losing strategy. There's good reason to believe that the idea of resurrection was introduced into the Jesus story after His death as an affirmation of faith in the future purposes of God. It was not intended as proof of some supernatural miracle as it has often been misunderstood today. In spite of Jesus' inspiring, confident message about the coming reign of God's empire of peace and love and justice on earth, His followers had to face the stark, discomforting reality that their Jesus of Nazareth was eliminated by the Empire of Rome. And the earliest affirmation in Jesus' resurrection is provided to us by the Apostle Paul about 20 years later in 1 Corinthians. This is important because Paul is the only New Testament writer who claims that he had a vision of the resurrected Christ Himself. And he uses 2 words to express his experience. He simply states, I had a revelation. I had a vision. It appeared like a vision to me. What's more, Paul uses the same words to describe how Christ appeared to Peter and to everyone else. In other words, what they had, I believe, and most of us in the progressive Christian tradition, was a mystical experience of the presence of the risen Christ, not some kind of physical reality. But a generation later, some Christian preachers were uncomfortable with Paul's account of the resurrection of this spiritual reality. And so these self-appointed redactors began to write gospel accounts of Jesus' life, fleshing out the stories of resurrection, if you will. And they believed, as many do today, that the best way to convince others of the spiritual reality of Christ's continuing presence was to cite evidence of a physical bodily resurrection. And while I'm sure they had good intentions, how the physical can prove the spiritual is really beyond me. Later believers in Jesus created material that described the actual sightings of Jesus as if they were saying, let me prove Jesus' resurrection to you. Mary saw Him in the garden and thought He was a gardener. The 12 communicated with Him in the upper room in Jerusalem. 2 disciples thought they saw Him on the road to Emmaus. And what's not to like about the risen Jesus? He sought out those who betrayed Him and forgave them. He went to the one who doubted and reassured him. He appeared to friends who were grieving and comforted them. He even went to the beach and had a cookout with His disciples. But there's a big difference between what Paul is saying and what he experienced and what Matthew, Luke, and John depict in their stories. Another challenge for thinking Christians is that whereas the stories about Jesus' crucifixion are substantiated later, they're collaborated by Jewish, Roman sources. A close examination of the stories of Jesus' resurrection are incredibly different. They're even contradictory, and they're affirmed by no one else, not even Paul and Peter. The apostles never mention an empty tomb or about any physical appearances to women. Even in the Gospels, the stories are so different. Mark anticipates Jesus' appearance, but none happens. Matthew reports appearances, but only in Galilee, where Jesus speaks parting words to disciples on a mountain. Luke says Jesus was seen only in Jerusalem, and his disciples are bid farewell there as he ascends into heaven. Only excruciating, and we got to be honest, mental gymnastic exercises can harmonize all these different stories into one. And there's more. Whereas the Gospels treat crucifixion of Jesus as a public event, resurrection appearances are always a private event. Now I know if CNN and C-SPAN had been there, they would have put the gruesome crucifixion on live TV. But even the authors of the stories of the resurrection of Jesus, they know that it was not historical in the ordinary sense. So what kind of stories are these? What did our early Christian ancestors make of these resurrection claims of Jesus? I believe the answer is essentially the same for us as it was for those faithful Jews during the Greek period. Both Jewish and Christian beliefs in resurrection are rooted in a faith that there is a good, loving, and just God, and evil will not win in the end. Jesus' vision of how human life could be lived with God's help, it came to its demise in his execution. And his followers could have decided, well, that was just the impossible dream of a peasant prophet. But that's not the conclusion they drew. Instead, his followers expressed confidence that in the future, sometime in days to come, Jesus' vision of life would prevail, not that of his executioners. And they affirmed through their stories of resurrection that God was vindicating everything Jesus did, said, and stood for, and that his Spirit, that we call Christ, is not dead, but it lives in our hearts and our minds today. A couple of years ago, I really enjoyed hearing Anne Lamott at Chapman University. She's a self-described award-winning author. Many of you have read her, I'm sure, and a Christian. She leaves her audiences both laughing and praying. She was raised in a secular Jewish home, but for an extended period of time in her life, she took a lot of drugs, drank a lot of alcohol, and it almost destroyed her life. And though she was a good student, an athlete, and writer, she wrestled with these personal demons that sought to defeat her. And she tells her own personal experience. And it's almost like reading a modern-day Apostle Paul when she says, "One evening I became aware of someone with me, hunkered down in the corner. The feeling was so strong I actually turned on the light to make sure no one was there. And of course there wasn't. But after a while I knew beyond any doubt that it was Jesus. I thought about my life. I thought about my progressive friends. I thought about what everyone would think of me if I said I was a Christian. It seemed an utterly impossible thing that simply could not be allowed to happen. So I turned to the wall and said, I'd rather die." But she didn't die. She started a new life. She encountered the resurrected Christ. The way I see it, there's 3 responses to Easter and these stories. You can believe it's factual, that it was physical history, despite all the evidence to the contrary, and many people do, and I know that gives them comfort and hope for life after death. Or you can reason, like a lot of modern people do, that what really works in life is power to determine your own destiny and the world's destiny. And that generosity and peace and justice and all of that stuff really doesn't work. It's all about self-interest, political regimes, economic systems. If these are the powers that truly rule human life, then faith in a loving, just God is kind of delusional. Or like the Jews, like Jesus himself, like some of his followers, we can keep holding to resurrection hope. We can believe that the compassionate quest for justice and peace does matter and someday will prevail. Human life has a lot of pain, a lot of disappointment. There is injustice, and all of us have to face death. But resurrection faith is the hope in personal transformation and the possibility that we can renew the world. That's why I believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And at times, I've been fortunate enough to sense Christ's real presence, pushing me beyond my comfort zones to work for peace and justice in the world, not just pray for it, especially for people who are mistreated, pushing me to be a peacemaker where there's conflicts, pushing me to share my bread with the hungry. And it's the same presence I feel every week when I come here to worship with you. It's the same presence that stirs my heart to try and love where it's absent. Maybe I'm delusional, but it's the reason I believe in the resurrection, not because I've seen something, but because I've experienced this presence in my life. And to me, that is resurrection in the real world. Amen.